it's very interesting in Australia. We have the Business Council of Australia, which is an employer group, very large employers, and they have certainly more and more, they have been putting out publications and they're becoming directly to us to say they actually see this as the way to go. They're very concerned with the state of Commonwealth-state relations. They're concerned about the lack of focus on the issues about workforce participation and productivity. And so they are trying to make it as part of their agenda, and they're asking, well, how can we assist? So to that extent, at the sort of higher order level of employers, I think we've got them in the frame of that. But it's actually, I agree, this type of change really requires a much more broader set of the community to want to be part of it. Now, in a cynical sense, the reason that we need this is First Ministers are obviously the most political of politicians. They are the leaders, they win power. And if your leader ain't the first priority to win power, well, they're not going to stay in power. And how they do that in Australia, and I'm sure it's replicated overseas, they understand what we call in Australia, how do you put this in terms of the punter? And in Australian terminology, that means the average person. What does it mean for me when I go to work, when I want my kids to get a job, when my mother can't get into a nursing home? What does that mean? And we're looking at how do we actually, and we try to get the Premier to talk in that language of what does it mean for the punter. And I think that's a lot of the effort and work we'll be doing, not so much by me, but people that are much better communicators in that area about putting our thinking into that. But I think it's eminently able to be, because it is all about, I want my child to have an ability to have a good job, but continue to have a good job throughout the rest of their life. I have children that are significantly disadvantaged. Generally in the community there is concern for them. There's a lot of money going to it, but it's not working. Community understands that if we could get it to work in the right areas, in the long term, they feel better as a community. They don't want these kids that are left on the waste heap. So all those things.
I think the next question is really focused on this new word that I've just learned, a punter, which is just the average person. So a question was raised around in this agenda, how do you address what happens in many countries where there's a skills mismatch? We have people with high qualifications, but they're in low skill jobs. So it's that different part of how will your agenda address that so that people are matched according to their qualifications? Or do you see that as an issue in Australia?
I think there is a range of issues. Really, in Australia, probably the more bigger issue, although I think that is a real issue, because particularly for people who are recently migrated and they would have very good high-level skills, but they're not actually achieving them. It's particularly in that area we have that problem. We also have, which I raised, the more real big, large problem, which is we have far too many young people not achieving Year 12 and equivalent, which, as you would all know, is the starting point to having good, reasonable jobs for the rest of your life. So whilst I think there's the two issues here. How this works is both from the point of view of agreeing, as we say, on these are the outcomes we want, so that's increasing the portion of school, entering school with basic skills, but increasing the proportion of young people, etc., those outcomes I talked about. But the ultimate outcome of this whole agenda, as I talked about, is growth. And when you have a highly strong, growing economy that is decreasingly not welfare dependent, that type of economy creates better jobs. And it's in the creation of those better jobs that these people who have better skills have greater opportunity to actually compete for those jobs. So I actually see it as a function of what comes out of it in terms of them. For those that don't have the basic skills, I think it's very much deeply about the policy actions we undertake.
I think there's a whole set of questions that touch on the issue of outcomes. And you've mentioned outcomes, Helen, several times, as this whole agenda is driven by proof. So a couple of questions here are around when we think about career development, what sorts of outcomes would people who are responsible for this agenda accept as evidence that career development really is a linchpin contributor to what you're trying to achieve? And kind of a second question to that, how do we start to get support for actually gathering data and doing research that demonstrates the impact of initiatives? And so I know those are two very broad questions, but perhaps the outcome issue would be important. And then is there support in this agenda to support research that will be demonstrating not just immediate impact, but medium and long term, which is an issue often for our field because our results are often not immediate. They takes time for people. So maybe some comments on that.
I think I'll go a bit broad first because I think it's very interesting, the things that you're working on. One of the outcomes of what I've been doing, it's been quite interesting in the sense that as we're focused in this area where we're saying the push for social policy should be on preventive policies as against remedial, and all the effort and dollars go into the acute end of any policy arena, all these things, there's these people that have been working in government, say in preventative health or in the areas that you have, burst out of the seams. Somebody's putting the sun on them and they're really excited. It's actually quite interesting. And we've got all these great ideas and there's all this best practice evidence and, you know, we think this actually does work. We know it, but we could never get anybody interested enough to put sufficient resources into it to actually show it. So to some extent, I think, you know, the work you're doing here today, and I assume is evidence of a long-term view about professionalism and best practice evidence in this area, which hasn't probably had the focus of it as a much broader agenda rather than fixing up margin, you know, problems at the margin, I suppose, you know, incremental change. So I think part of it's that. And so when I look at what outcomes would influence and say, well, what I put up before, I think it's the two key outcomes of this agenda, which is increasing the proportion of young people making a smooth transition from school to work or further study. Obviously, career advice, career development is fundamental and part of that process. And increase the proportion of adults who have skills and qualifications needed to have active and productive life. Underpinning that, again, is a concept of lifelong learning, which is underpinned with knowledge about what is the right way to do this. So I think in both cases, I haven't brought with me today, but behind all this, the concept is that you put these outcomes up. We then say, well, is there measures that would tell you you've actually had progress? And the work we're doing at the moment is very much focused on what set of measures tell you that you've actually achieved that. When we've progressed it quite a substantial amount, and underpinning that again is what data exists to do that. And if a data source doesn't, what's the one that replicates it or we could produce over time? So there is a lot of work about data that will inform and underpin an understanding of tracking, if you do over time, these outcomes and measures. So that's where the data side is. And I think the area that I did comment on, there is a real lack of data. I've been quite, you know, fascinated because for years and years we've talked about this problem of young people and jobs. But the reality is there's very, very poor data that actually tracks them. So I've always been a person that how can you develop good policy if you don't actually understand the underlying data? You know, what is it actually, and if it doesn't exist and it's only partial, it actually makes it even more difficult. But there's been, I understand, quite a lot of more work recently that is actually trying to focus on that question. And part of our work, if it goes forward, which I you know, hopefully it will be about making sure not every single data set, because you can get lost in this stuff, but the very important data sets do get the support to actually be and deliver and produce that outcome. And there's a number of, Commonwealth state bodies like at the Productivity Commission that have for the last 10 years trying to get better data sets in these areas. So there's a good fertile ground for this. So I think it was in that point, but is there, what was the research and best evidence, is there money for that? I mean, I think it's actually a quality judgment. This is a 10-year reform program. It's not about the next 6 months. There will be, because you've got to keep First Ministers and the community engaged, I would envisage by December, if we're really on the money on this, that we will agree with the outcomes, we will agree the progress measures, and we will agree some early initial actions that underpin that process. But it's a 10-year program. And so in that context, research and understanding are going to underpin a program that's of such a substantial reform nature. So it's inevitable. So I would see that would be the case.
Coming back to the punter, there's a question here that's quite interesting around the older worker, which is really an issue that's emerging in many countries. And a question around, in the agenda, what consideration is being given to encourage older workers to stay connected either to employment or to being very active at the community level? The question here is, could we have scholarships that encourage older workers to actually skill themselves for post-retirement careers, or to actually become people who share information about their trades in schools, who become really active in your human capital agenda and starting to make best use of their life experiences? What consideration, or is that a piece that's being looked at in an imaginative and innovative way? Could you comment on that?
I mean, older workers clearly is absolutely fundamental to one of those gaps that we have in Australia, where we've got substantial reduction, particularly in older male participations after 49. You see substantial drop-off. Now, some of that is about things that are to do with, let's create better quality jobs for them, let's create sort of avenues about how they could actually stay in the workforce, and they've got the skills to do so. Some of it's in another area that I didn't talk about, which is in work incentives, and this is a lot in the Commonwealth arena, which they've done a fair bit of work on, but I would say over the next 10 years there'll be a lot more, which is about tax incentives, superannuation incentives, and how they operate in the market, which either discourage or disencourage you to stay in the workforce. But the other side of it is, I don't think you can forget, a lot of these older workers that are there, they are not voluntarily there. And they're not because it actually goes back to this issue that we have a lower proportion of young people and older people without a basic skill qualification. And I, again, see this as an area of how do we let this happen? It's not all about the highfalutin end. As I say, it's about the punter. It's about making sure if you haven't, and you're a blue-collar worker, as we call them in Australia, and you've been working on a building site and your back's gone, which happens, I've been working workers' comp, and I can tell you it happens a lot, that your end of life isn't on a workers' comp social security payment, it's actually into another productive part-time job, which somebody through a career counsellor has helped you, and you've got a set of skills and you're productive in the workforce. But it's not in something that uses this physical aspect of you, but actually means that you're a productive individual. And I think it's about things like that, honestly, than the others are important. I think the tax side will deal with a lot of that. It's actually this bit, and that's harder core problem. But actually, in a way, I think it's fixable, but with a set of lens that actually focuses it on this way, rather than this is the cause of their own problem, they're unhealthy individuals or whatever has happened. It's actually to do with their educational attainment and the opportunities that prevents them participating in the workforce.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm sorry, but that's the time that we had for questions. I'm going to just turn the mic over to Peter to thank Helen in a moment. But could I just make one personal comment? I think just listening to the passion with which you speak about these issues, Helen, it's wonderful to see human capital really being talked about and felt about as human development. So that's what I'm hearing so much. You're talking about, well, your punter is the example, but it really is the human development portion, which is the passion of people in this room to contribute to the human capital agenda. To talk about it in those terms is really so refreshing. I've really enjoyed the session. Your questions are beautiful. We'll have them typed up, and maybe we can talk Helen into, I don't know, we'll find some way to follow up and get some more questions answered. But thank you, Peter.